Grace Thompson, a 38-year-old woman, was engulfed in deep pain and confusion following the sudden death of her husband, Andrew Thompson. Andrew was a respected businessman, known for his integrity and success. Yet, despite the admiration he received from colleagues and friends, his marriage to Grace had deteriorated over the years. The spark that once fueled their relationship had faded, and the days filled with laughter and meaningful conversations had become scarce. Grace felt lonely, trapped in a marriage that no longer offered the warmth and attention she so desperately craved. Andrew was often consumed by his work, leaving little time or space for the love they had once shared. Feeling neglected and emotionally distant, Grace found solace in the arms of Lucas Carter, a colleague of Andrew's. Lucas was everything Andrew no longer was: charming, present, and attentive. He had a captivating way of making Grace feel special, rekindling the joy she believed she had lost. Lucas listened to her patiently, showing genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. Slowly, he became the person Grace could trust, someone with whom she could share her fears and frustrations without fear of judgment. Their relationship, which began as a friendship, soon blossomed into something deeper and more intense. Grace felt alive again, experiencing a passion she hadn't felt in her marriage with Andrew for a long time. When Andrew died of a sudden heart attack, the shock was immense. Despite the issues in their marriage, Grace had never imagined it would all end so abruptly. Andrew's funeral was a grand event, fitting for a man of his stature. People from all over came to pay their last respects, but behind the mask of an inconsolable widow, Grace wrestled with conflicting emotions. She felt the loss, but also a strange sense of relief and freedom, as if a new life was about to begin. During the funeral, Grace maintained her impeccable composure, receiving condolences with grace and serenity. However, her heart was racing, not with sadness, but with anticipation for the future she envisioned with Lucas. She knew many would judge their relationship, especially considering how quickly they had become involved after Andrew's death. For this reason, after a few months had passed, Grace and Lucas decided to marry in a quiet ceremony, away from prying eyes and societal judgment. They wanted their love to remain untainted by malicious gossip or disapproval. As they embarked on their new life together, Grace and Lucas knew that their path wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to face whatever challenges came their way, believing that the love they shared was worth every sacrifice. Grace and Lucas decided that the only way to leave the past behind was to move to a new town, a place where they wouldn't be surrounded by the memories of Andrew. They chose a small coastal town, peaceful, with tree-lined streets and welcoming houses. It was the perfect setting to start anew, far from everything that reminded Grace of her old life. She felt relieved to leave behind the house she had shared with Andrew, the neighbors who knew her story, and even the places they used to visit together. Their new home was exactly what Grace had always dreamed of: spacious, with large windows that let sunlight flood the rooms. She threw herself into decorating every corner, carefully choosing each piece of furniture, every painting, and every detail, with the aim of transforming the place into a true home, a refuge of peace and comfort. Lucas helped with everything, wanting her to feel completely at ease in this new beginning. As the months passed, life seemed to stabilize. Grace smiled more, began to make friends in the new neighborhood, and devoted herself to new hobbies, things she had never had time for before. The nights were calm, and Lucas was always by her side, ensuring she felt safe and loved. It seemed that, finally, Grace had found the happiness she had long sought. But despite all the tranquility their new life offered, Grace began to be disturbed by dreams that left her feeling uneasy. At first, the dreams were vague, almost like distant memories of Andrew, but soon they became more frequent and vivid. In each dream, Andrew appeared before her, his face full of expression, as if he were desperate to tell her something. Yet no matter how much he moved his lips, no words came out. Grace always woke in the middle of the night, breathless, with a sense of anguish she couldn't explain. One night, after yet another of these dreams, Grace woke up abruptly, her heart racing. Lucas, who was beside her, noticed the movement and immediately sat up, concerned. "Grace, are you okay?" Lucas asked softly, turning on the bedside lamp. She took a moment to respond, trying to shake off the feeling of despair the dream had left behind. I had that dream again, Lucas," she finally said, her voice trembling. "He was there trying to talk to me, but I couldn't hear anything. It's like he wants to warn me about something, but I don't know what." Lucas sighed, running his hand through his hair before pulling Grace closer. "Grace, that's normal. You've been through a lot in a short time. It's natural that you're still processing everything. Maybe it's just a little guilt or regret about moving on so quickly. But you know we did what was best for us." Grace looked at Lucas, wanting to believe his words, but the discomfort lingered. "I know, but these dreams disturb me so much, Lucas. They feel so real. And I can't understand what he's trying to say." Lucas gently squeezed her hand, trying to convey reassurance. "Maybe it's just your mind trying to deal with all of this, love. I'm here with you, and we'll get through this together." These dreams will fade with time, I promise. Grace nodded, but the unease she felt didn't dissipate. She snuggled closer to Lucas, seeking comfort in his presence, but the thought of what Andrew might be trying to communicate continued to haunt her mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. 3 years had passed since Grace and Lucas's wedding, and their lives seemed to have settled into a comfortable rhythm. The memories of Andrew, though never completely erased, had become less frequent, and Grace was deeply immersed in her new routine. She had thrown herself into her work, which often took her on short trips to nearby towns. On one of these trips, on an ordinary weekday, Grace found herself in a small charming town known for its old well-preserved streets. It was a sunny afternoon when Grace decided to explore the town a bit before her meeting. She walked leisurely down the main street, admiring the shop windows and the bustle of people around her. The sounds of conversations, laughter, and footsteps blended with the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. Everything seemed so peaceful and normal, a perfect setting for another routine day. Suddenly, as she passed in front of a cafe, Grace stopped abruptly. Across the street, a tall man with a firm posture caught her attention. He was standing, chatting animatedly with a woman and a child, who appeared to be about 5 or 6 years old. The sight of the scene sent a jolt of electricity through Grace's body. The man. He looked exactly like Andrew. Her heart started beating faster, and for a moment, she couldn't move a muscle. It was impossible. Andrew had been dead for years, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same haircut, the same facial features, even the way he moved. Everything was so familiar. Grace felt the air leave her lungs, as if the world around her had stopped spinning. The man laughed at something the woman said, leaning forward in exactly the way Andrew used to when he was engaged in conversation. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Was she seeing things? Perhaps it was just someone who looked like him. A bizarre coincidence. As she tried to rationalize what was happening, the man suddenly raised his head and looked directly in her direction. Their eyes met for a brief second, but it was enough for Grace to feel a knot form in her stomach. There was something in that look that was unmistakable, something that made her heart nearly stop with its intensity. Andrew. It couldn't be. But before she could react, before she could cross the street to confirm what her eyes were stubbornly showing her, the man turned, said something quickly to the woman and child, and got into a car parked nearby. Grace tried to move, but her legs felt like lead. She watched, paralyzed, as the car drove away, taking with it the man who might, or might not, be the ghost of her past. It all happened so quickly that by the time she finally managed to take a step forward, the vehicle had already disappeared around the corner, leaving her with a sense of emptiness and confusion, a question pounding in her mind. Could it really have been Andrew, or was her mind playing a cruel trick on her? The sight of that man had unleashed a storm of doubts and fears within Grace. She could hardly process what she had witnessed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of that man again, so similar to Andrew's, and confusion took hold of her mind. How was this possible? Andrew had been dead for years, yet the image of that man, his features, his gestures, they were identical. When Grace finally returned home, her mind was still in turmoil. She walked through the front door and found Lucas on the sofa, reading a book. The moment he saw the state she was in, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. Grace, what happened? Lucas asked, closing the book and getting up to meet her. Grace, still dazed, let her bag drop to the floor and sat down beside him. Her face showed a mixture of shock and confusion. Lucas, I saw someone today, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I was in the neighboring town, on the main street, and I saw a man. He was identical to Andrew. Lucas frowned, trying to understand what Grace was saying. What do you mean, identical? He asked, trying to stay calm. I know it sounds crazy, but it was him, Lucas. The same face, the same way he moved. Grace placed her hands on her head, as if trying to organize her thoughts. He looked straight at me, and for a second, I felt like it was really Andrew. Lucas sighed and took Grace's hands, trying to convey calm and reassurance. Grace, I understand that this has shaken you, but it must have just been someone who looks like him. You know how our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're tired or stressed. Grace shook her head, resisting the logic Lucas was trying to impose. No. Lucas. I know it might sound absurd, but something inside me says it wasn't just a coincidence. There was something in his eyes, something that made me feel it wasn't just a physical resemblance. And then, he got into a car and left before I could do anything. Lucas hugged her, trying to soothe her, but he could feel the tension in Grace's body. Maybe you should try to rest a little. It could be that your subconscious is bringing up memories that haven't been fully resolved. Perhaps tomorrow, with a clearer mind, you'll see everything differently. Grace gently pulled away from Lucas's arms, her determination growing. I can't just ignore this, Lucas. I need to go back there, try to find him again. If I don't, I'll never stop thinking about it. I need answers. Lucas looked into Grace's eyes, seeing the resolve in her gaze. He knew that once she decided on something, it was hard to make her change her mind. "All right, Grace," he said, finally relenting. "If you feel like this is something you need to do, then go. But I want you to be careful. I don't want you to get hurt with false hopes." Grace nodded, grateful for Lucas's support, but deep down, still haunted by the vision of the man who seemed to carry with him the shadows of a past she thought was buried. Consumed by a restlessness that wouldn't let her be, Grace decided she needed to understand what had really happened before Andrew's death. The sight of that man who looked so much like her late husband had sparked an urgent need for answers within her. She knew she could no longer ignore the doubts that haunted her, so she began investigating Andrew's life in the months leading up to his death. Her first stop was Andrew's old office, a place she hadn't set foot in since the funeral. The atmosphere was heavy with memories, and every detail brought back images of her husband, but Grace forced herself to stay focused. She was greeted by a few of Andrew's former colleagues, who still mourned his loss, but it didn't take long for casual conversations to turn into intriguing clues. "Andrew was different in the last few months before," said one of his colleagues, a woman named Susan who had worked at the desk next to his. "He seemed distant, worried about something. Often, he would just stare into space, like he was trying to solve some huge problem in his head." Grace frowned, trying to understand what that could mean. "Do you know if he mentioned anything specific that was bothering him?" Grace asked, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Susan shook her head. Thoughtful. "Not directly, but I remember overhearing him on the phone a few times, talking about trips. He seemed tense. I'm not sure where he was going, but it wasn't like him to be so agitated." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She needed more information, something that could connect the dots that were beginning to form in her mind. After thanking Susan, she went to see Andrew's former boss, a serious and reserved man named William. "Did Andrew make any unusual trips in the months before his death?" Grace asked bluntly, while William observed her with a serious expression. "Yes, several actually. And one of them stood out because he returned much earlier than planned, much earlier," William replied, interlacing his fingers on the desk. "He seemed uncomfortable, like he had seen something that deeply disturbed him." "Do you know where he went?" Grace asked, her heart beating faster. "Yes, I remember clearly. He went to the same town where you said you saw that man. A small town not far from here." Grace's stomach churned. This couldn't be a coincidence. Something was wrong, and the feeling that there was much more behind Andrew's death began to intensify. She thanked William and left the office, her heart heavy with the new information. When she returned home, Grace couldn't hide her agitation. Lucas noticed immediately. "Did you find out anything?" he asked, concerned when he saw Grace's pale face. Andrew was going to that town frequently before he died. Something was bothering him, and no one knows exactly what it was. "But Lucas, this can't just be a coincidence. He was involved in something, and I need to find out what it is," Grace replied, her voice filled with determination. Lucas approached, holding her hands firmly. "Grace, are you sure you want to go through with this? What if the truth is harder to accept than you imagine?" "I need to know, Lucas. I need to understand what happened, because I feel like the answer is out there, somewhere, waiting to be discovered," Grace said, her eyes staring into the distance, but her mind racing with possibilities. As Grace rummaged through Andrew's old documents, a chill ran down her spine. The first thing that caught her attention was the bank statements. There were large sums of money, amounts she never knew existed, being transferred to an unknown account. Each transaction seemed to deepen the weight of a secret Andrew had kept from her, and the sense that something was terribly wrong intensified with each new page she turned. Driven by the need to understand what this meant, Grace began meticulously examining Andrew's office, searching for any clue that could explain these transfers. That's when she found something she hadn't expected. A safe hidden behind a bookshelf, cleverly disguised among the books. Her heart raced as she tried to recall the combination. After several attempts, the safe opened with a soft click. Inside the safe, Grace found a series of documents, each one more disturbing than the last. One of them, in particular, made her feel the ground crumble beneath her feet. A birth certificate of a child, with Andrew's name listed as the father. The mother's name was missing, but that didn't matter in that moment. The shock of discovering that Andrew, her Andrew, had a child she never knew about was devastating. Grace stepped back, holding the document with trembling hands, unable to process what she was seeing. "Is it possible?" she asked herself, trying to keep her sanity amidst the whirlwind of emotions. "Could Andrew have had a second life, a secret life that I never knew about?" She looked again at the papers scattered across the desk, each one a piece of a puzzle that seemed impossible to put together. Why didn't he ever tell me? How could he hide something like this from me? The questions hammered in her mind as she felt increasingly drawn into a mystery she hadn't even imagined existed. Grace knew this changed everything. The image of Andrew that she had held onto until that moment became increasingly distant as new facets of his secret life emerged before her. She needed to find out more, to understand why all of this had happened. But at the same time, she felt a growing fear of what else she might discover. The initial shock gave way to a cold determination. Grace knew she couldn't rest until she uncovered the whole truth. She forced herself to turn her attention back to the remaining documents, each one potentially more revealing than the last. And as she scrutinized every detail, she couldn't help but wonder, what else was Andrew hiding? And how far did this second life extend? As the silence of the office enveloped her, Grace realized that her search for answers was only just beginning. Grace decided to return to the city where she had seen the man who had left her so unsettled. This time, she was determined and had done her homework. She spent the afternoon investigating and managed to track down the address of the house where the man lived. Her heart pounded as she approached the residence, a small house with a well-kept garden, typical of a quiet suburban area. She stopped in front of the door, trying to muster the courage for what she was about to do. The sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the door made her heart race even faster. The door opened slowly, revealing the man who, to Grace, looked like an exact copy of Andrew. The man was tall, with light brown hair and a well-groomed beard that accentuated his features. To Grace, he was identical to Andrew. His eyes had a depth that sent a chill down her spine. "Hello?" the man said, his voice sounding friendly but with a hint of curiosity. "Can I help you?" Grace swallowed hard and tried to stay calm. "Hello, I'm Grace Thompson. I saw you in the neighboring town, and well, you look a lot like someone I knew." The man frowned, clearly surprised. "I'm sorry, but I think you're mistaking me for someone else. My name is Michael Bennett." "I don't know any Andrew Thompson." Grace stared at him, trying to process the information. There was something in the way Michael Bennett spoke, a tone of voice, a mannerism, that made her feel like he was hiding something. "No, I'm sure I saw you," Grace insisted, her voice firmer now. "You look exactly like a man I knew, and this coincidence can't be just a matter of appearance." Michael Bennett looked at Grace with a perplexed expression. "I understand that this might be unsettling, but I can assure you I have nothing to do with this Andrew Thompson. You must have mistaken me for someone else. I've lived here for years, and my name is really Michael Bennett." Grace was frustrated and confused. Michael's insistence on denying any connection to Andrew only heightened her suspicion. She tried to read his eyes, searching for a clue, but he seemed genuinely perplexed. "I'm not trying to accuse you of anything, Michael," Grace said, trying to calm her voice. "But there's something about you that's familiar, in a way I can't ignore. It's not just the appearance. It's something in the way you move, in your look." Michael took a step back, seeming a bit uncomfortable. "Look, I understand this must be hard for you, but I really can't help. If you have more questions, I suggest you contact the local police. I have a life here and prefer not to be bothered by these kinds of confusions." Grace stood there, watching him slowly close the door. She felt torn between the need to get more answers and the fear of invading the privacy of someone who apparently had no connection to Andrew. Even so, something about Michael's behavior made her believe that the truth was closer than she imagined. Determined to uncover the truth, Grace began to follow Michael discreetly, observing every step he took. She discovered that he led a simple and seemingly ordinary life. He worked at a small local company, a modest office almost imperceptible on a quiet street. Michael adhered to a predictable routine, leaving home early for work and returning in the evening, always alone. Grace followed him for days, trying to find any flaw in the facade of normalcy he displayed. She was consumed by the need to understand why this man, so identical to Andrew, had appeared in her life like a ghost from the past. Every movement Michael made, every gesture, felt like a provocation, intensifying the doubt and anguish that gnawed at Grace. One day, when she was sure that Michael was at work and no one else was at home, Grace made a risky decision. With her heart racing and her hands trembling, she broke into Michael's house, determined to find any clue that might unravel the mystery. Inside the house, the atmosphere was simple and welcoming, but it carried a strange sense of familiarity. The walls were decorated with pictures of landscapes and common objects, but nothing seemed to reveal who Michael really was. Grace began to explore every corner, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. While opening a drawer in Michael's small office, Grace found something that made her heart stop for a moment. There was a wooden box, carefully stored, as if it was something of great sentimental value. With trembling fingers, she opened the box and found old photographs. As she examined the photos, Grace was shocked to see images of Andrew when he was younger, but there was something strange. In some of the photos, Andrew was next to another man who looked exactly like him, but with subtle differences. Michael. Underneath the photos, Grace found an old letter, with the ink slightly faded. The envelope was addressed to Michael, and the sender was Andrew. With her heart in her throat, Grace opened the letter and began to read. The handwriting was unmistakably Andrew's, and the words in the letter were a devastating revelation. In the letter, Andrew explained that after a long investigation, he had discovered that he had a twin brother, separated from him at birth. Michael. He described the emotion and shock he felt upon discovering the existence of a brother he never knew he had. Someone living a completely different life. Andrew confessed in the letter that he had never had the courage to tell Grace the truth. The weight of this secret had tormented him for years, but he feared how this revelation might affect their marriage and the life they had built together. Grace could hardly believe what she was reading. Andrew's words hit her like a wave of conflicting emotions. She was faced with a truth that changed everything. A secret Andrew had taken to his grave, and that was now, unexpectedly, revealing itself. Shaken by the devastating discovery she had just made, Grace couldn't simply leave things as they were. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Michael. With Andrew's letter in hand and her heart heavy, she returned to Michael's house. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps, only a cold and unyielding determination. When Michael opened the door and saw Grace standing there with a resolute expression on her face, he immediately knew something was wrong. Before he could say anything, Grace pushed past him into the house. "I read the letter," Grace said, her voice firm but laden with emotion. "Why didn't Andrew ever tell me about you?" Michael slowly closed the door, the weight of the situation settling on him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as if searching for the right words. "Grace, you have to understand," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "Andrew. He always felt immense guilt for never looking for me before. He knew something was missing, that there was a piece of his life that wasn't there, but the truth is he didn't know how to handle it." Grace crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "But why didn't he tell me? Why keep this a secret, leaving me in the dark?" Michael looked directly into her eyes, pain evident on his face. "Andrew was afraid, Grace. When he finally found me, he was already sick. He knew time was running out, and the last thing he wanted was to burden you with more problems. He loved you too much to do that." Grace shook her head, trying to process everything she was hearing. "Did he plan to tell me? Someday?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes. He wanted very much to tell you. He wanted us to meet, for you to know the truth. But the heart attack. He didn't get the chance. He thought he had more time." Michael's words hit Grace like a wave of sadness. She had spent so much time trying to understand what was happening, and now that she finally had the answers, they were more painful than she could have imagined. "I just wanted to understand why all this happened," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Why didn't he trust me to handle it?" Michael stepped forward, his expression softening. "Grace, Andrew trusted you more than anyone. But he was scared, and in the end, he tried to protect you, even if it meant keeping the secret. He never wanted to hurt you." Grace felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. She looked at Michael, seeing in him a shadow of Andrew but also something different, something she still couldn't fully grasp. "I don't know what to do with all this," she admitted, her voice low and filled with uncertainty. Michael simply shook his head, unsure of what to say. "I don't know either, Grace. But I think Andrew wanted us to find a way to move forward, to deal with this together." Grace was deeply troubled by the large sums of money Andrew had regularly sent to Michael. Despite all the shocking revelations, this issue still gnawed at her, like a missing piece of a crucial puzzle. Determined to get answers, she decided to confront Michael once again. When she arrived at Michael's house, anger and frustration were clear on her face. As soon as he opened the door, Grace got straight to the point. "Michael, I need you to explain why Andrew was sending you so much money," she demanded, her voice firm. "It doesn't make sense to me. Why would he do that?" Michael hesitated, looking down at the floor as if searching for the courage to respond. He knew the truth would be hard to swallow, but he couldn't hide it any longer. "Grace, Andrew was involved in something you would never have imagined," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "He got caught up in a corruption scheme at the company." A chill ran down Grace's spine as she heard those words. "What?" she murmured, barely able to believe what she had just heard. "Andrew, involved in corruption? That can't be true." Michael sighed deeply, running his hand over his face as if trying to erase the image of Andrew he knew he was about to destroy. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. Andrew found out that some of the executives were embezzling funds, and instead of reporting them, he got pulled into the scheme. He was always a man of principles, but the pressure was too much." Grace stepped back, feeling the ground slip away beneath her feet. The image she had of Andrew was rapidly shattering. "So, the money he was sending you," she began, trying to piece it all together. Michael nodded, clearly ashamed. "It was to protect me, Grace. Andrew knew he was taking risks, and the money was his way of ensuring that I would have a better life if anything happened to him. He always felt guilty about being separated from me, And this was his way of trying to make up for it, even if it meant compromising his own integrity. Grace remained silent, trying to process it all. She looked at Michael, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. "He never wanted to tell me any of this?" she asked, her voice faltering. Michael slowly shook his head. He was afraid of how you would react, afraid that you would see him differently. "Andrew always loved you, Grace, and he didn't want to disappoint you. He thought that if he could keep it all a secret, he could protect you from an ugly truth." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. The revelations were too much to take in, and she didn't know how to cope with the fact that the man she loved and admired was involved in something so dark. "How could he do this?" she whispered, more to herself than to Michael. "He was lost, Grace. And the only thing he thought he could do to save a bit of his soul was to make sure that I, at least, had a chance at a decent life. But he never wanted it to happen this way." Grace stood there in silence, feeling more confused and betrayed than ever. She no longer knew who Andrew was, nor how to deal with the revelations that continued to crash over her like overwhelming waves. Grace's discoveries cast a new shadow over her life, but this time, it was a real and palpable threat. After uncovering the secrets Andrew had kept hidden, she began receiving anonymous messages. They were veiled threats, but the message was clear: hand over the documents or face the consequences. Sitting at the kitchen table with trembling hands, Grace held one of the notes while Lucas paced back and forth, worry etched across his face. "Grace, this is serious. We need to get out of here now," Lucas said, his voice filled with urgency. He approached her and firmly held her hands. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Grace looked at him, her eyes reflecting the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Fear, yes, but also a growing determination. "Lucas, I know you're right to want to protect me, but I can't just run away," she replied, trying to stay calm. "Andrew may have made mistakes, but I need to clear his name. These people can't go unpunished." Lucas shook his head, frustrated by Grace's stubbornness but also understanding what drove her. He knew it was hard for her to cope with everything she had discovered, and even harder to accept that the man she loved had been involved in something so dark. "Grace, please think about this. These people are dangerous, and they don't care who they hurt to get what they want." Lucas sighed heavily, leaning closer. "It's not worth risking your life for this." Grace gently pulled her hands away and stood up, feeling the weight of the decisions she would have to make. She walked to the window, looking out at the city, which now seemed full of shadows and dangers. "I know it's risky, Lucas. But if I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been done. Andrew can't defend himself anymore, but I can. And I will." Grace turned to him, her voice firm despite the fear. "I won't let them erase his memory with lies." Lucas saw the resolve in her eyes and knew that nothing he said would change Grace's mind. He approached her again, this time more calmly, trying to find a solution. "Then, if you're really going to do this, we're going to do it as safely as possible. We need to be prepared. We can't underestimate what these people are capable of." Grace nodded, grateful for Lucas's support but also aware that the road ahead would be dangerous. She knew the threats wouldn't stop until she managed to reveal the truth. The nights grew longer, every noise seemed more threatening, and constant fear became her companion. As the danger closed in, Grace felt her determination grow even stronger. She wasn't just fighting for Andrew, but for herself and everything they had shared. Lucas, though reluctant, knew he was now just as involved as she was. "If we're going to do this, Grace, we're going to do it right," Lucas said, his voice now echoing the same determination he saw in her. "We'll expose these criminals, but with caution. I won't let anything happen to you." Grace looked at him with a faint smile of gratitude. "Together. Lucas. We'll end this together." The decision was made. From that moment on, Grace knew there was no turning back. She would face any danger that lay ahead, determined to clear Andrew's name and confront the truth, no matter the cost. In the final confrontation, Grace and Lucas were suddenly captured by Andrew's accomplices. Taken to a remote and dark location, Grace felt terror pulsing through her veins, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Tied to metal chairs, they were surrounded by men armed with guns, their faces cold and merciless. "What do you want?" Grace asked, her voice faltering with fear. One of the men approached, crouching down to meet her eyes. "We want the documents, sweetheart. The ones you found and hid. Hand them over, and this can all end quickly." Grace exchanged a look with Lucas, who was beside her, trying to remain calm despite the terrifying situation. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the space, and all eyes turned toward the door. Michael appeared, determined to save Grace and put an end to the nightmare. "Let her go now," Michael commanded, his voice firm as he approached the kidnappers. The tension in the air was palpable, the men exchanging uncertain glances while keeping their weapons aimed. However, before any of them could act, Michael drew a gun from his waistband, ready to rescue Grace. But then, something unimaginable happened. In the midst of the confusion, a shocking truth came to light. Lucas, the man Grace believed to be her safe harbor, revealed his true role in the corrupt scheme. Lucas. What's happening? Grace asked, the desperation in her voice evident. Lucas let out a heavy sigh, his eyes avoiding hers. Grace, I always knew about Michael, about the money. I've been involved in this the entire time, he admitted, his voice full of regret. I needed the documents to make sure nothing got out of control. I was using you to get them. Grace felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Lucas's betrayal hit her like a knife to the heart, deeply cutting her trust. The man she thought was her ally, her partner, had been manipulating her all along. How could you? Grace whispered, her words filled with pain. I trusted you. Lucas lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. I made the wrong choices, Grace. But I still care about you. At that moment, Michael took advantage of the distraction to act. Amid the ensuing chaos, he managed to disarm the kidnappers, leading Grace to safety. However, Lucas escaped in the confusion, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Now saved but with her heart shattered, Grace realized her life had been turned upside down. The love she felt for Lucas had transformed into a bitter mix of pain and betrayal. Michael, what do I do now? Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper as she sat in the back seat of the car that would take them away. Michael looked at her with empathy, his expression softening. You start over, Grace. Leave it all behind and rebuild your life the way you deserve. Grace knew that this was the only way out. With a heavy heart, she made the decision to distance herself from everything and everyone. In a new city, where no one knew her past, she would dedicate herself to rebuilding her life. But the scars of betrayal and lost love would stay with her forever, reminding her of the choices that led her there. Meanwhile, somewhere, Lucas watched from afar, his intentions uncertain. He promised himself that one day, he would return to finish what he started. But for Grace, the future would be written without him, on a solitary path, yet perhaps a truer one. If this story touched you, inspired you, and warmed your heart, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. If you're someone who spreads love and good things, share this story with those you think deserve to hear it and be transformed by it. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next video.